My name is Maria, and the first time I told my husband no, he didn't shout. He didn't even open his eyes. He just lay there in the dark with his back to me, breathing the slow, careful breath of a man who is deciding something. And I lay beside him, listening to the wind scrape along the eaves and the wood stove ticking as it cooled in the kitchen below. And underneath all of that, my own heart hammering so loud I was sure he could hear it too. I waited for him to be angry. Anger I could have answered. Anger has shape. What he gave me instead was nothing. And in the world I came from, nothing was the most dangerous thing a husband could hand his wife. The second time I said no came 8 days later. 8 days after that, I found out exactly what happens to a woman in my community who refuses her husband twice. I learned it the way we learned almost everything that mattered, in whispers, sideways, from another woman who pulled me by the sleeve at a barn raising and spoke without ever once looking me in the eye. I should tell you a little about where I come from before I tell you the rest. I was raised old order Amish in a farming district in Ohio, the kind of place where the rules of the household were never written down because they didn't need to be. Everyone already knew them. I married at 19. I left at 26 with one suitcase and a silence inside me heavier than anything I carried in my hands. If parts of this story sound impossible to you, I understand. I would have said the same thing once. But I lived every hour of it. And I am only telling you now because I finally have the words for what happened to me. Words nobody in my old life would have recognized, let alone used. In the world most of you live in, when a wife tells her husband no, the conversation is over. That's simply where it ends. Where I grew up, no wasn't an ending at all. It was an opening, a crack in the floorboards that the whole community could feel through their feet. And once they felt it, they came. Not with fists, not with raised voices, with something quieter and in its own way crueler. A slow, deliberate withdrawal of warmth from every direction at once, so gradual that you didn't notice you were freezing until you looked up one day and realized you were standing entirely alone. The theology I was raised on could be summed up in a single sentence, repeated from the pulpit so many times it stopped sounding like a sentence and started sounding like weather. The wife submits, the husband leads. There was no footnote about her exhaustion, no verse about the nights her body had simply run out of anything left to give. I remember our bishop standing at the front of the meeting house when I was 17, saying plainly that a wife who refuses her husband opens a door, and that the devil is patient, and that he waits by doors like that. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and promised myself I would never be foolish enough to open one. I married a man named Jonas the spring after my 19th birthday. He was 22, quiet-handed, serious-mouthed, the kind of man people described as steady, which in our community was the highest compliment a man could receive. Everyone told me how fortunate I was. The wedding filled my father's barn with 300 people, chicken and pie and creamed celery, and by the time the last buggy pulled out of the lane that night, I had been on my feet for 19 hours straight, and my new shoes had cut my heels raw. That first year was, I understand now, a kind of training year, though no one called it that at the time. I learned the rhythms of his house. He learned to expect supper waiting when he came in from the barn. We had our son before our first anniversary and our daughter 14 months after. By 22, I had 2 children under 2, a house to run, 3 meals a day to put on a table that never seemed to clear itself, a garden that needed weeding whether I'd slept or not, laundry to wring by hand on a washer my father had built me, and a husband who could not understand why I sometimes fell asleep sitting upright at the kitchen table with a spoon still resting in my fingers. The night I refused him the first time, I had been awake since 4 that morning. Our baby had been sick for 3 nights running. Our oldest had a fever that wouldn't settle. I had spent the whole afternoon canning tomatoes, nearly 50 jars of them, and something in my lower back had gone past aching into something that felt permanently bent out of shape. When Jonas reached for me in the dark, I put my hand over his wrist, gently, and I said, "Not tonight. Please, I just need to sleep." He went still. That's the detail that has never left me, the stillness, his hand frozen under mine, his breathing shifting into something controlled and deliberate, the whole room seeming to hold its breath along with him. Then, without a word, he turned his back to me and stayed that way until the sun came up. I lay there beside him for hours, wide awake, listening to him breathe, wondering whether I had just broken something between us that no apology could put back together. By the time I came downstairs the next morning, he was already gone to the barn. He came in for breakfast and ate without looking at me once. He went back out, came in again at noon, ate in the same silence, spoke gently to the children, and never said a single word to me. That pattern held for 5 straight days. My husband moved through our home like I had become furniture, like I had stopped existing in any way that mattered to him. On the 6th day, my own mother appeared at my door with a basket of bread, and I watched her watch me the way mothers watch when they already suspect the answer before they ask the question. "Is everything well between you and Jonas?" she asked. And I, who had never once lied to my mother in my entire life, told her yes, everything was well. She nodded slowly, the way you nod at something you don't believe but have decided not to fight. Then she said one thing before she left. She told me that a wife who lets the cold into her own house has no right to be surprised when that house freezes around her. That was the whole visit. She picked up her empty basket and walked out my back door without looking at me again, and I sat at that table for a long time afterward, turning her words over. I didn't fully understand them yet, not in that moment, but somewhere beneath my exhaustion I understood that a message had been delivered to me, and that it hadn't come only from her. It had traveled through her from somewhere much larger, from generations of women in kitchens just like mine, who had been handed that exact warning by their own mothers and had passed it forward without ever questioning why. That night, when Jonas reached for me again, I didn't say no. I didn't say anything at all. I simply let it happen, and afterward I turned toward the wall and cried as quietly as I knew how, so quietly that not even the baby sleeping in the cradle beside our bed could hear me. 8 days passed. I refused him a second time. I don't even remember the reason anymore, only that I was so tired my body answered before my mind could stop it. "I can't, Jonas," I said. "I'm sorry, I just can't." He turned his back again, and the silence returned, except this time it arrived with a different weight to it. This time it had teeth. The next morning, my sister-in-law Rachel stopped by with her 3 children in tow and stayed nearly an hour. She never mentioned Jonas. She didn't have to. Instead, she mentioned, almost in passing, a woman 2 districts away whose husband had eventually gone to the bishop about her. She mentioned how difficult things had become for that family afterward, how the bishop had ultimately had to bring in the woman's father and her brothers to settle the matter. She said all of this while sipping coffee at my kitchen table, never once glancing in my direction, the exact way the women in my world had perfected the art of delivering a warning while appearing to discuss the weather. 3 days later, the bishop's wife arrived without any warning at all. She gave no reason for the visit. She drank her coffee slowly. She asked after my children, and then her eyes moved unhurriedly around my kitchen, my floor, my dishes, the thin layer of dust collecting on top of my pie safe. Finally, with a gentleness that somehow made it worse, she told me that a wife's very first responsibility is her husband's peace, that everything else in a household comes after that nothing else comes before it. Then she finished her cup and left. The following Saturday, there was a barn raising, and behind the long tables where the women were setting out the noon meal, an older woman named Lydia, someone I barely knew beyond her name, set down a tray of bread next to me and stood close, speaking without ever turning her face toward mine. "Child," she said, "I'm going to tell you something nobody told me, and I'm only going to say it once, so listen carefully." She told me that when a wife refuses her husband one time, a decent man understands that as tiredness, nothing more. But a second refusal, she said, that becomes a pattern. And a pattern is what the men start discussing quietly by the fence after services. By the third refusal, his mother gets involved. By the fourth, his father. By the fifth, the bishop himself comes to the house. And by then, she told me, it no longer matters what you have to say for yourself. It only matters what they've already decided to do about you. She straightened a loaf of bread on the tray without looking at it. They don't strike us, she said. That isn't our way. What they do instead is harder to fight because there's nothing to point to. They pull the warmth out of your house one piece at a time until you're so cold you'd do almost anything just to feel warm again. Her husband stops speaking to her, she explained. Then his mother stops visiting. Then her own sisters suddenly find themselves too busy on the very days they used to come around. Then the women at church begin sitting on the far side of the room. Then even her own mother starts looking at her the way you look at a field that failed to yield anything that season. And one morning, child, you wake up and realize the entire world has gone silent around you, and the only door left open anywhere is the door back into his bed. So you walk through it, and the warmth comes flooding back, and everyone is smiling at you again, and you spend the rest of your life telling yourself it was your own choice. She looked at me directly then, just for a moment, the only time she did the entire conversation. It was never your choice, she said. There's no word for what it actually was in the language we were both raised speaking. So instead, we call it being a good wife. Then she picked up her empty tray and walked away, and I stood there with both hands pressed flat against the edge of that wooden table, feeling the entire architecture of my life quietly rearrange itself behind my eyes. I wish I could tell you I went home that night and confronted him, that we had the honest conversation that should have happened years earlier, that everything changed from that point forward. Nothing like that happened. I went home, made supper, bathed my children, and lay down beside my husband in the dark, and I let the warmth return, because Lydia had told me the truth, and the truth was that the price of refusing was a price I wasn't yet strong enough to pay. Not with 2 small children depending on me, not with no money to my name that was actually mine, not against a community that would close ranks around my husband and leave me standing outside every door I had ever known how to open. I stayed 4 more years after that. I had another child. I learned to read my husband's silences the way other women learn to read storm clouds, learned to tell from the set of his shoulders at the supper table whether the coming night would be one I could simply get through or one I needed to brace myself for in advance. I became, in the vocabulary of the only world I knew, a good wife. And quietly, invisibly, in some part of me, the community had no way of reaching. Something small and stubborn kept growing anyway. Something Lydia had planted that one afternoon behind a tray of bread. When my youngest turned 3, I left. I won't walk through exactly how that happened today because it's its own story and it deserves its own telling. What I will tell you is that the shunning came precisely the way Lydia had warned me it would, only on a far larger scale. My mother's letters started coming back to me unopened. My sisters crossed the street rather than pass me on the sidewalk. My father, the last time I ever laid eyes on him, looked straight through me as though I had become made of glass. But here is what the years afterward eventually gave me. What happened to me in that quiet, deliberate way after I dared to refuse my husband twice. What continues to happen in farmhouse after farmhouse, in communities like the one I grew up in, every single season of every single year, finally has a name out here. Several names, actually. My therapist handed them to me slowly, one at a time, the way you'd feed broth to someone who hadn't eaten properly in years. Coercive control, punishment disguised as withdrawal, compliance enforced by an entire community acting as one, consent that isn't really consent at all once refusing has been made too costly to survive. Where I came from, none of those words existed. We had exactly one word for the whole arrangement. We called it marriage. I want to be careful here because I'm not telling you that every man raised in that world is cruel. Jonas wasn't cruel. He was a man shaped by the same silence that shaped me, handed a script for what a husband was supposed to be, and he followed it because it was the only script anyone had ever offered him. The bishop who preached that sermon when I was 17 wasn't a monster either. He was an old man repeating words that had been repeated to him decades earlier. The mothers and sisters-in-law and bishops' wives who showed up at my kitchen table with coffee and quiet warnings weren't villains. They were women who had once stood exactly where I was standing, who had once let the cold in themselves, who had once felt the warmth return and decided to call that relief love, because the only other word for it would have shattered them completely. The system is the thing at fault here, not any single person caught inside it. A system that turns a tired woman's no into a problem for the whole community to solve. A system that decides her exhaustion is an open door for the devil. A system that makes yes the only word in the entire language that's actually allowed to be safe. If any part of you grew up somewhere that taught you your body wasn't fully your own, I see you. If you've ever lain awake beside someone in the dark and said yes purely because you were too worn down to survive, what saying no would have cost you, I see you too. If you were ever taught that being good meant slowly making yourself smaller and smaller until there was nothing substantial left to refuse anyone with, please hear me when I say this. You weren't weak. You were surviving inside a system specifically built to make sure refusal always came with a price attached. If stories like this one matter to you, the kindest thing you can do is stay close, follow along, and say so in the comments, because so many of us spent years thinking we were the only ones who'd lived through something like this. Lydia died 2 years before I finally left. I went to her funeral anyway, stood at the very back of the room in my plain dress and prayer cap, and watched them lower her into the ground beside the husband she'd spent 51 years married to. I thought about that single afternoon behind the bread table, about the way she looked directly at me for just one moment, and about the small, terrible, generous gift she gave me that day by simply telling me the truth out loud instead of letting me find it on my own, the way she'd apparently had to. She is the reason I understood exactly what I was walking away from when I finally walked. She is, more than anyone else, the reason I'm able to sit here and tell you any of this at all. If something in this story found you tonight, tell me about it. Tell me if you've ever had your own Lydia, someone who pulled you aside and told you a truth nobody else was willing to say out loud. And if these stories are the kind you want to keep hearing, hit follow. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and leave whatever's sitting in your chest right now down in the comments because somebody else reading them tonight needs to know they aren't alone in this. Until next time, hold on to this one thing. Your no is a complete sentence. It always has been. No kitchen, no community, and no quiet man with his back turned toward you in the dark ever gets to decide that it means anything less than that.